Ja, guten Abend und
Good evening and welcome to this open forum session, this vintage 2008. We have a topic that is perhaps not the most appropriate given the recent stock market turbulences and the subject being private equity and hedge funds, friend or foe, whether they destroy our economy and the enterprises or not. But I think that this subject is still a very topical one, and I'm sure it will go on concerning us and taking up our time in the next few years. In 2006, these private equity and hedge funds and deals and investments saw great growth for hedge funds. The hedge funds have become a very interesting vehicle for investors, and the more recent form of private equity has become a very interesting form of investment, more recently in Europe and in the UK, for longer in the United States. And private equity funds, of course, are also exposed to a lot of criticism. There's this image of locusts sweeping through Germany and destroying Switzerland, destroying enterprises and companies, making lots of people redundant and lose their jobs. There's been a lot of criticism in Switzerland, in Germany, in the UK. In Switzerland, Sulzer and Oerlikon have been the target of private equity firms. So critics see this vehicle as a danger for the financial system. Is there a need for more regulation? Switzerland does have a law, but is it sufficient? I'm very much looking forward to this debate this evening. We have some eminent persons here. On my right hand, we have two practitioners, Philippe Yer, right on the right, Chief Executive of 3i, one of the leading private equity firms in Europe. His firm invests mainly in North America and in Western Europe, not so much in the emerging markets, but my second guest here on my right, Mr. Fletcher, Paul Fletcher, is Senior Managing Partner at Actis Capital in London, and his company invests mainly in emerging countries. So we've really covered the entire range of private equity and hedge funds. Then on my left, extreme left, Mr. Christian Levrat, who is going to be the future president of the Social Democratic Party in Switzerland as of the 1st of March of this year. He's a member of Parliament, the Swiss Parliament, and Hans Ruhr, who is an ethics specialist, a professor of theology, and he is the president of Blue Value, which is a company that invests according to ethical criteria and values. Now, let's look at definitions first. What is private equity? What are hedge funds? There's a lot of confusion. Even the experts are not quite in agreement on definition.
Philip, give us a sort of definition. What is it, private equity? What are hedge funds? And what kind of investments do you undertake? How do you view this issue?
Thank you very much. Well, the reason I'm here is principally to help fill in this information gap, because there's been a lot written about private equity and hedge funds and lumping us together. Firstly, let me define. Private equity is a medium-term investment in a private company. And 3i Group has been in existence for 60 years. In fact, we were founded by the British government after the Second World War, but we've been listed for about 11, 12 years now, and we have around 5 billion of our own funds that we invest in leverage buyouts, companies with debt attached to them, into growth capital. This is private companies which normally have a majority shareholder, who maybe be the founder or a family, growing a company. Principally these days we're backing bigger companies that are growing around the world. We have a part of our business that supports venture capital. We do that in the US and in Europe. And we also have a growing part of our business is infrastructure. But the defining feature is that these are companies which are not quoted. We have a separate division that does that. But so that's private equity. And we go in, and because they're private companies and we are a private shareholder, this is a position that is for the medium term. We go in with what we call a 2, 3, 5-year agenda with that company, expecting to be part of that company's board, expecting to be with that person as they grow value. Hedge funds, and I'm not passing judgment on hedge funds have a very different time scale. They can be in and out of shares hourly. They have a different role in the financial system, and I think it's very important that sense of how long we invest is differentiated right at the beginning, and the fact that we are fundamentally an industrial investor. We invest in real companies with management, with products, with sales, with employees, with a role in society. Hedge funds tend to invest in financial instruments that get traded.
You've also been an investor into Switzerland?
Yes, we have. In fact, in a previous life, I'd been at 3i now for coming up for 4 years, but I know it was 7-8 years ago, I was chairman of a leveraged buyout, Leica Geosystems, which came to my firm from a previous private ownership under a family, and we bought it using leverage, and then we listed it in Switzerland a few years later. So I've seen that journey with a leading Swiss company.
Mm-hmm. Paul, you're mostly investing into emerging markets. Give us the overview of your activity there.
Thank you. I'm amused at your introduction of being a locust, insofar as I have spent the last decade of my life investing in countries or continents, Africa, India, China, Latin America. Our business is exclusively emerging markets. We are a private equity firm and essentially do the same business that 3i do. We've been doing this for a long time. Philip has just reminded me that we are also an outgrowth of the British government just after the Second World War. So when I go to countries, I find that we are talking to people who recognize that we have been making investments and harvesting our investments in these countries and building their infrastructure, building their economies over a very long period of time. There is a distinction, and if there was one point I'd just like to make up front, is that what we do is that we invest in growing businesses. Businesses in the emerging markets, that is their characteristic. Sometimes it is a different characteristic from some of the businesses that are invested in developed markets. But if I give you a sense that some $40 billion was raised last year for investment in private equity into the emerging markets, that's up from some $5 billion 6 or 7 years ago. Companies in the emerging markets, they get their capital from two sources, equity and debt. 65% of the capital that they obtain is from equity. What we have been doing over a long period of time is providing equity capital, oftentimes into markets where it's very difficult to get it. Where do you go and get equity capital? In developed markets, you can go to the stock market. In many of the markets in which we invest, you cannot do that. So the private equity industry has stepped in and provided this equity to allow businesses to grow. And with that equity comes professional management of that equity. The way I'd like to describe it is that it's actually smart capital. As we invest in a business, we take a very active interest in it. We actively help the management. We help them with their strategic planning. Oftentimes these are businesses that don't have great financial control. We help them with that. They're businesses that typically don't understand how to plan their human resources. We help them with that. There are businesses that have not had access to external markets. We help them with that. So there really is an intense activity set on our behalf. And just one last point I'd like to make is that many of the businesses that we invest in, frankly, have been businesses that have been set up by families. They've grown significantly. And you know what family businesses are like. They tend not to take care of the governance of these businesses. They tend not to organize a board in a way that's transparent. And so private equity firms like us have a huge influence in establishing boards, establishing the governance of these businesses, so that over time they're ready oftentimes to be sold to a strategic investor to build them further, or to be sold to the public markets. Let me leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So we've had two very positive presentations and definitions. Mr. Wu, as an ethicist, What is your response to whether they harm or whether they do good? Well, we're still on definitions, aren't we? So I would like to reserve the right to add something to that later on. But even when we just discuss the definition, we need to accept that the hedge funds have not really been defined properly. I think we need to talk a little more in detail about this kind of investment. As was said, the timescale is very short, where with private equity the investment period is much longer, which is positive. So in hedge funds you have a shorter timescale, then you have the legal situation as well. You have a higher degree of legal regulation and regulatory situation in the case of longer time frames as in private equity, and as the time frame is shorter in hedge funds, there's less degree of protection, and then there's the whole issue of transparency. There is only a certain measure of transparency, even though in the case of private equity, you don't really know exactly who the investor is, and even less so in the case of hedge funds. Then liability and the share of responsibility. In the case of private equity, the people involved have a more positive attitude in growing a business, whereas in the case of hedge funds, the main objective is to get as much performance out of the company, out of the enterprise, and is not really committed to increasing the value, is perhaps more in favor of destroying the value of a company. It's more speculative. Then there are the different instruments used in strategy. In private equity, I think it's quite clear. It's mainly investment in the company. In the case of a hedge fund, you have multiple strategies. You have encapsulation of debt certificates and all sorts of things, and no one really understands how it works. It's very obscure and non-transparent. So one has to make a distinction between these two types of investments. They all have their ethical pitfalls. I'd say that private equity is, in ethical terms, more or less acceptable. Then, of course, it depends on the form that it takes. But in the case of hedge funds, I have the feeling, as per definition, that it is not ethical at all. But I reserve the right to come back on this later on. Mr. Lebrun, how do you see that? Are they friend or foe, harmful or beneficial? Because in Switzerland, as I said earlier on, there have been some very old and traditional companies that suffered from hedge funds or private equity. What is your evaluation answer? I don't think that you can put the question in such general terms whether it is harmful or beneficial. It depends very much on the activities of the various funds or hedge, whether it's a private equity or hedge funds, and then it depends very much on the regulatory framework. So it's our own fault in the political world if we have not set a necessary regulatory framework at an early stage, and can see this in one of the big Swiss trade unions when we have exchanges with our European colleagues. If we look at what had happened in Swiss Metal in Reconvilliers, where we had an attack from an investment company and the debates are still ongoing. I have two other examples which have made me very suspicious regarding the business model that is behind the activities of private equity funds. And let me just mention Tele Denmark, which is the parent company of Sunrise. What happened is as follows, and other companies have reported the same kind of business models. Private equity firms and a consortium approach a company with an offer of capital. Then capital is raised on the markets with a debt ratio of 20 to 80. Tele Denmark was then taken over for an amount of 12 billion euros, and the first thing that they did was that 7 billion of the 12 billion that it cost was then transferred to Tele Denmark, which then became a very sick company, which basically had been very sound and healthy and now has an indebtedness rate of 90%. The management was simply kicked out and replaced. This new management now has to reduce the headcount by 7% every year. That is an objective, and all the positive values are simply drained from the company so that the private equity companies can benefit from that and can skim this off. So this makes me very suspicious of this kind of business model. A second type is even more worrying, not only from a political point of view, but also from trade union. Hercom in the Netherlands in 2001, this was a company taken over by private equity funds, and after the takeover, the investments were reduced from 700 million euros to 200 million euros, and at the same time the private equity company simply skimmed off 400 million in the same time frame, that's to say 3 years. So what I can see happening in these companies is not that private equity is offering minority participation as a kind of venture capital, but rather that it is a planned attack over a period of 4 to 5 years.
Positive view on your industry? Are these just some bad apples, or is this a systemic question that your industry is not as nice as you said it would be?
Well, can I, clearly it is complex, can I take some of these issues right on the head? Because, I understand issues of employment, issues of leverage, and issues of transparency. And the reason I'm going to take them right on the head is we've had in the UK over the last 9 months quite a big debate about this in the public arena, and there's some very clear views that I have that I think are pretty similar to many in our industry. Let me start at the top. I think let's leave the growing companies to one side for a minute. Let's talk about leveraged buyouts, because that's what most people mean by private equity. They mean an acquisition of a company with debt to enhance the returns. And of course, when it all goes well, there's not an issue. And from time to time, too much debt gets put on a company, and there is an issue. So let's be honest about that. There are, if you like, those errors made. My own experience, and I've been in and out of this industry for most of my career, is that if you have a company that is giving customers what they want, that has got a good product, good ethics, good employees, if there is too much leverage on it, what happens is the private equity firm suffers because the banks or others take control of the company, more equity goes in, and the customers don't notice, right? The customers don't notice because it's in everybody's interest that this business continues. And therefore, in those circumstances, I'd say it's fair. The private equity firm loses its money because it made a wrong judgment. This is not an easy game. And that is, I have to tell you, my personal experience, and 9/10 of the adjustments that take place don't make it to the press, right? And somebody has made a bad investment and they have suffered. The second point I'd like to make is that, hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but you talk about money being scraped off the top to go to the private equity firm. Let me take you behind the private equity firm, because actually what we do is raise money mainly from pension funds, mainly from institutions. So in fact, what we're doing is what we're trying to do for the most part is create value for savers. And those savers will be people in this room, people in rooms in the UK. Our own company is public. We have many, many shareholders. The share price until the very recent past had nearly doubled over a 3-year period. It's not a secret club. People can go and buy our shares and be part of that. So yes, we get paid for that, but genuinely there is money, there's value created for savers behind. So I think it actually it's a very moral activity. Now let's get to the issue of employment. And we talked about growing companies earlier on. I will be honest with you, it's not every company where our aim is to grow employment. There are companies that need adjustment from time to time, and I think there will be a philosophical difference between us.
It's also cutting employment in this case.
Yeah, and let's put it on the table. I am proud of our company, and I think I can persuade most people who are capitalists that actually there is value in the recycling of skills, the recycling of resources against where the economy is going. And I think that is one of the forces of capitalism, and that will mean from time to time that employment does need to be adjusted. The question then is the method by which that dialogue takes place, right? To be perfectly honest with you. And back to governance, what we do is we have boards who work to the law of the country, who work to ethics that we have, to make sure that when such adjustments are necessary, that they are handled in the best possible way. But that is a small minority of the transactions we're involved in. We don't set out with employment as our priority. I know you're part of a union group that asking private equity firms to say the overall objective of private equity is to grow employment. I wouldn't sign up to that. The overall objective of private equity is to grow value for the long term of society. My own experience is a large element of that comes from growing sales and all things. From time to time, it comes from having to adjust employment. That is the reality of a modern society. The last point, which is transparency, I think is a function of a young industry. This industry is probably only about 20 years old. And as that industry has grown from being a very cottage industry, a very private industry, where people didn't have to explain, you kind of knew the names of these firms, but really nobody knew what was behind. And the industry has now got to a size where it is purchasing some very substantial companies that the man in the street quite rightly says, that's my company. Even though I don't own it, that company has a role in society. I want to know what's going on around that company. And therefore, in the UK, all the leading private equity firms have just signed up to a code of conduct that will make sure that companies of a certain size in terms of employment and also or certain market capitalization, if they were a public company before, actually will continue to report the activities of the company even after they've been taken private. So I think the industry does understand that.
Okay, Mr. Liver, just a short remark on the employment question.
Ja, vielleicht.
Well, may I respond to the 3 points mentioned? Unemployment. In November of last year, Birmingham University published a study which confirms our criticism. It's a very wide study, a comparison that was made of firms taken over by private equity and firms that had cooperated with other investors. And this study showed that 20% of jobs in firms taken over by private equity were lost after the takeover. 20% of jobs were lost. So this is a very strong criticism which the trade unions are expressing about the private equity business model, and this study confirms this. And I do agree with you. The study also states that in the long term it does lead to the creation of jobs. And there's no answer as to whether the overall evaluation is positive or negative. But the takeover by private equity is bad news for employees, and this has been confirmed by a neutral body. Secondly, the problem is not just the loss of jobs, but the way in which they are lost. You are quite right when you say that private equity then take on an operational role. They are members of the board of the companies they've taken over. Their business models are very tight, are very restrictive, so that the management of a company has very little leeway or margin of movement, and private equity funds refuse to act as employers. They refuse to assume the responsibilities of employers. Blackstone, for example, controls companies that employ 380,000 people worldwide, but refuse to assume the responsibility as an employer, except for the 750 own employees. And I think this is a bit short-sighted for an investor who wants to take on a leadership position in companies that they have taken over. Third point, transparency. Of course, I welcome the step that you have taken. Let's say it's just the beginning of a step, to be quite honest. There are more steps to be taken. Very often you have chosen listed companies and therefore were able to get around the transparency obligations. They don't really have to report or disclose information, and very often these are public interest firms that are in question. So we'd be well advised if we adopted regulations and laws on transparency, not only for the private equity funds themselves, but also for the firms that are taken over by them. Well, we come to regulation in a minute and what could or should be done, but let's come back to the core subject. Does private equity kill off jobs? That, I think, this is the emotional dynamite.
Investing into emerging market companies. How about the employment question there? I mean, is there also sort of criticism that you are killing jobs there?
I think I made the point earlier. The simple answer is no, because almost universally we are investing in growing companies. So I cannot think of a single example over an extended period of time where we have invested in a business where the strategy has been to seek operational efficiencies by reducing headcount. In fact, let me just tell you a story, which is, I think, an exciting story of a business that we first invested in 1999. It was a mobile telephony business. Launched by a Sudanese entrepreneur. At that point, he had 5 employees and he was based in Amsterdam. Today, that business is in 18 African countries with over 6,000 employees, with some 7 million Africans benefiting from the use of mobile telephony. During that journey of the increase in employment, I would say that we found ourselves heavily criticized in the 2000-2001 as a firm for backing the investment in Africa, of all places, of a new technology when what we should be doing was investing money in the agricultural arena, where clearly that is where the employment need was. I'm happy to tell you that The Economist magazine, some years later, remembered what they'd said and came back and told this story. And I tell you that because the entirety of the equity that was delivered to that mobile phone business was given by private equity investors. I think of the employment in Tanzania. In 2000, 2001, a whole slew of U.S., typically American investors, companies withdrew from owning power stations around the world. They withdrew back to their home markets. And if I look across the emerging markets, whether it's in Latin America, I look at it in Africa, I look at it in Bangladesh, I look at it in Pakistan, who were the people who actually retained the power generation assets? The private equity industry. On the narrow issue of employment, you asked that question. We don't have that issue. I mean, I was actually going to ask a question here, which was you asked. The private equity industry to accept responsibilities as an employer. I mean, I'd like to sort of dig behind that and ask what responsibilities exactly do we as the private equity industry need to take on?
May I pass it on to the ethicist? What is your point of view about the employment situation? Are you asking me the question about responsibility or liability? Well, I think one could respond with the help of a stakeholder model. But let me say right at the outset, when you come onto the stage with so much capital, then it's no longer really a private sector matter. It's very public, and I think the strategy should take into account what's going on, that it's not just something reserved to the private sector, but that it really concerns the public, that is a public interest undertaking. And secondly, we must know that money usually develops its own dynamic. Aristoteles already said that money doesn't have any young, doesn't bear any young, doesn't produce young or children. And all sorts of other authors and philosophers have said similar things, and Goethe and others. I don't want to go into the details. So you have to be very careful. You need a lot of care and diligence in terms of regulation. At the time of globalization and deregulation, we have to be even more careful. And it is true that politicians and parliaments didn't take the train or the bus early enough. And sometimes it's not even possible to do anything to catch up anything anymore, because it makes no sense to have any regulation. But the crux of the matter is private equity creates a stakeholder culture in that the employees are part of a good wage earning system, have possibilities of further training, of being part of a corporate culture, a social culture. That's one thing. And then how do the companies concerned deal with their consumers and customers? Is there transparency, information? What is their attitude and behavior vis-a-vis of suppliers? Do they just press the lemon until it's completely dry, like in the case of Gomez? What's its views vis-a-vis of the environment and environmental protection? If all of this is acceptable, why not? I myself have advised a private equity company, but it's very much a question of content. Well, Mr. Lebrun, what about the proposals of Mr. Roux in practice? Well, it's not just a question of being a private investor. I think one has to lay down certain boundaries regarding the business model when it comes to private equity. One has to abide by the rights of the employees, for example, the diligence of information, disclosure of information to the employees concerned. And it's only a very small minority of private equity companies that actually observe these rules or conventions. If it's not done before the deal is concluded definitively, it should be done at least immediately afterwards, so that the employees know what the business plan is going to be. They should be informed in a very transparent way. And those who take the decisions, whether it's management and so on, should also lay themselves open to discussion and answer questions when there are questions. Secondly, the rights of negotiation should be recognized. We have seen very often in the case of takeovers that the collective wage bargaining agreements are simply terminated by the private equity funds or companies and replaced by something that is not in conformity with the ILO rules and conventions. Very often the trade union rights and employees' rights are not observed after such takeovers. The traditional attitude of private equity is not as simple as that. They cannot just say that we refuse to assume the responsibility as the employer and then at the same time impose such narrow restrictions on the management so that the management cannot give to the employees what is their due. And I think all these takeovers would work much better and more smoothly if transparency were observed.
You want that?
Yeah, well, the reason I'm trying to intervene here is that I'm not here to defend other private equity firms, okay? And I think the big danger of part of this conversation is implying public ownership good, private equity firm ownership bad? There are, Enron was a public company and it failed. Okay, so the big passion of me is that part of the failure of public companies to create value is a lack of strategic direction and many other things that private equity brings. And if you look at many company failures over the years, they failed because there's been a board of directors who've been very comfortable, who've not taken the hard decisions to move a business forward, and ultimately there's no one counting the loss to society of under-management of businesses over a long period. And one of the things that private equity does do, actually, is try and recreate strategies for companies. Sometimes that involves adjustment, but I do resent the implication that private equity firms, because of a few examples, are bad companies that need to be regulated. The law on employment exists. The law on consultation exists. It does. And so my challenge is, what is there that is peculiar about the form of ownership, as opposed to some of the practitioners? What is there about the form of ownership that actually requires a special regulation? And I think that was part of the problem in the UK when you peeled it away and said, what is the harm that people are trying to legislate for? And actually, it was an information gap. It wasn't. The protection of employment legislation was there. The duties of directors not to over-leverage companies was there. So there are structures that deal with these things, whether it's a public company or a private company. My own company, before I joined them 4 years ago, bought SR Technics, the aircraft maintenance arm, out of Swiss Air. When we sold it, which was sold under my leadership a couple of years ago, through acquisitions and enhancements, it had double the employees. It had both Airbus and Boeing in its suite, whereas before it was just one of the brands. It was a much bigger and stronger company than it had been during, and I'm not going to comment on the circumstances that led to that, but I'm just making the point that it's not all private equity bad and public company good. Having said that, we're a public company. I'm proud of what we do. We publish an annual report. You can go on our website, www.3i.com. You will download, every 6 months we do a full set of report and accounts showing case studies that we do. Our annual report, we're in the FTSE. Last year we won the report for the prize for the best corporate social responsibility report of any FTSE 100 company. Now there's an irony. We're supposed to be these beasts, and yet we've been able to explain how we do corporate social responsibility. I'm just trying to say it's a more sophisticated than all private equity bad. I'm not going to defend everybody in our industry, but I do think in trying to go to the top and say, 3i or Blackstone has to engage with unions on all these different companies in our portfolio, I think he's missing the point. There are boards of directors. The companies we have, we make about 60 investments a year. We have about 400 core companies. We're selling off a very old portfolio. We have boards of directors. We operate in 14 countries. That's where the legal situation is. That's where the strategy is. That's where the customers are. And frankly, it's creating a nonsense to try and engage with me around the activities of any one of our companies. The customers, the unions, the employees are in these companies. There's boards of directors.
But we're hearing now a lot of positive stories from your side, but you cannot deny that there is an image problem. I think in the public view, those companies really do look like companies who, I may overstate now, but who do kill jobs. And don't you have a sort of problem within your industry that you're not really transparent enough or that you don't really inform the public well enough about what you do? Because everything you're telling here is now, we don't read it in the paper, we don't hear it on TV.
Well, so that's why. I mean, I'm sat here. Actually, my hotel room is a report that thick, which is the first report of a special study group through the World Economic Forum, where we're getting academics and others together to study this topic, because there is an information gap. I mean, for every Birmingham University study you find, we can find another 2 or whatever. It is a complex subject, and so. Actually, again, last year we worked with the World Economic Forum to say, let's get some leading academics, let's get some case studies, and let's try and get to the bottom of this question, because it's more complex than said. Mm-hmm. It is clearly of public interest, and it's clearly given the importance of the industry, something that there needs to be greater clarity on. And I'd love to tell you what it is, but it's being published tomorrow, and I'd probably be kicked out of the forum if I told you tonight.
But lassen Sie uns jetzt vielleicht doch zu dem Thema.
Could we then perhaps just turn to the next subject? What can we do? A new law has just been enacted in Switzerland. Companies that have a participation in another company, even if it's only 3% participation, they have to disclose it. Before it was 5%. This law was enacted last summer after the crisis that had prevailed in this area, and that was well debated in the media. Now, is that enough? Can we rest on the laurels? Is the problem resolved? Is it enough to have a change of from 5 to 3%, or do we have to do more? You're going to be the president of the Socialist Party in Switzerland as of next spring. Is it going to be enough? Answer, no, it's just a symbolic gesture. It's certainly not enough. After there were some incidents in Switzerland, I must say that I'm very happy that we've been able to clarify the situation a bit and that we're going to get more information. And I'm really very eager to read this report, which has been published or will be published tomorrow. I assume that at least what concerns jobs, after takeover by a private equity firm, our fears about jobs will be confirmed. I'm sure that the situation will change quite rapidly in Switzerland, probably because of a different subject altogether, because of the sovereign funds, which are now very much in the foreground. The call for protectionist measures will be quite loud. And these measures will probably not turn out as protectionist as they may be wished for, but they will also affect private equity firms because, particularly in the case of sovereign funds, as you know, in Switzerland, Singapore has now entered UPS with 12 billion. It's now got a very big share of the equity of UBS. The sovereign funds will probably have to be restricted as far as their institutional participation is concerned. That is to say, we will want to restrict their influence over our companies. We will want to protect our companies from such investors because the fear is, of course, that they don't have only financial objectives, not only private equity funds, but that there are also political ulterior efforts or motives. And then we will also have to take some measures very much like the efforts that were taken against privatization in the 80s. So there's going to be a lot of movement around this subject of the sovereign funds, especially with regard to transparency. And this will also affect private equity firms. The rules and regulations of transparency will also concern those firms which are not listed on the stock exchange. There have to be some measure of disclosure and reporting even for these companies. There has to be some kind of transparency so that one knows what happens within these companies, so that you can follow and understand the capital evolution and how capital changes. There has to be some kind of accountability. You know what has happened in the UK with Debenham, that was taken over with a debt of 600 billion. It was taken over by a private equity firm, and 30 months later, the private equity firm gave up Debenham with a total debt left behind of £1.9 billion. So we should be able to follow what happens. So you are in favor of a law that makes it compulsory and mandatory, that there is some transparency? Yes, of course, it would be good to have self-regulation through codes of good conduct or good practice or other kinds of agreements, but when it's a matter of protecting enterprises, companies, from the most extreme private equity firms. Well, have you found any allies in favor of such protectionist measures in Parliament? Of course, you know the answer. Perhaps people in Switzerland know what the situation is. We haven't got a majority yet, but in particular, the sovereign funds will bring about a change in the overall situation. We all understand that something has to be done. There's going to be so much of a public outcry that there will be some regulation, and every additional case that will occur will simply make the pressure rise. So in the medium term, I'm sure that such regulation will be introduced in order to observe these funds. So what do you think, Mr. Roux, self-regulation or not? Well, I am very much a supporter of this idea of regulation, but I don't quite believe in it, simply because on the one hand, we have not yet found a majority in favor of this, and secondly, on the other hand, what do we do about the lack of coinciding between the political and the economic efforts and intentions? That is why I would focus a little more all the efforts on self-regulation. You said that you have some sympathy for code of conduct. I would say that this has a greater value. I'd say, for example, that the bigger investors, the pension funds, have a value of 600 billion Swiss francs. What kind of private equity firms are turning to the pension funds and vice versa? Maybe we should have some ethical and social guidelines in the medium term that could be followed by the pension funds. I think this would be quite a big advantage. And then the second question is that we need solutions for the various sectors. The financial intermediaries and banks have to draft such rules and regulations themselves. They have to endow themselves with such rules. Obviously, we need a culture of self-regulation, whether we like it or not, and this on a worldwide level. Of course, regulation would be better, but there's no body there to impose such regulation, to enact it. So we also have to make sure that the customers, the consumers, pay a little more attention to the origin of investment, of capital, who are the investors. So we need new ideas, new modes. I believe that this 21st century will be the century of self-regulation. I don't think we have any other devices. We need to regulate the market ethically. The markets have to be married with ethics, not because I think it's particularly smart or clever, but I don't see any other solution, especially not a solution imposed from above.
Introduced in the UK, is that enough, or do we need more also in the UK?
Well, we think it's enough, but we've also acknowledged as an industry that these guidelines may have to evolve in due course. But we have a tradition in the UK of having self-regulating codes. The takeover code has worked very well in the UK to make sure that there are pragmatic, flexible rules that can adapt to a situation. And I think I personally feel very strongly about what is the issue that we're trying to regulate. If we discover that people driving Ferraris break the speed limit, do we have a law banning people with Ferraris, or do we? There are rules that stop people breaking speed limits, right? If you just happen to find that lots of Ferrari drivers do it, you don't suddenly pass a law that says they have to have a 10-foot flag on those. So it's about what precisely is the harm, and we have employment laws, we have these other things. The information gap, we recognise that there is a social responsibility there, and we have lots of other private equity firms are not listed, didn't have very good websites. So exactly your point, who were these people? How do I contact them? What do they look like? What's their? And those firms have now signed up to saying, we will have a website. We will state what our policies are. So there's been a big move to move into that space. And on sovereign wealth funds, I understand the concerns about, well, it's money, but is it money with influence? That That is an issue. But I have to tell you that the sovereign wealth funds have been around for a long time. They're very smart investors, and we shouldn't criticise those parts of the world that actually save up for the future, for their future citizens and whatever, and are looking for good investment opportunities, and compare it to some of the accidents we've had.
Well, I think your Prime Minister had a very pragmatic view on them compared to other politicians in the Western world. Paul, what's your view on the regulation question?
To be honest with you, regulation of the private equity industry in the markets in which we invest, China, India, Africa, Latin America, is a non-issue. The market is regulated for various reasons in terms of capital flows. I just want to bring the conversation back a bit. Private equity, friend or foe? And I've been listening to it, and in order to think that private equity is foe, the argument seems to rest on a narrow point of private equity sometimes lays off people. And private equity, in terms of its transparency and its consultation, has not done a good job. I think Philip has acknowledged that there is some argument on the latter. The former is part of creating efficiencies. I just parochially like to bring us back to say it is not helpful for an industry to be tainted across the whole of its industry for the sins and omissions of a few. The emerging markets where I operate, I think of the benefits that happen in the markets where capital goes in. You create a good, strong, robust company. You potentially sell it. You develop the capital markets. It goes in. It gets listed on a local stock exchange. We're building up the capacity in that country. You have, as I suggested, employment creation is one of the outgrowths of this. With employment comes higher taxes. With higher taxes comes a beneficial financial position for the countries. Anyone who would have walked with me last week around a hospital in Gujarat in India that we are the owner of, and had the discussions about whether we were going to put more money into that hospital, how we were going to do it, how we were going to bring expertise from offshore into that hospital, whether we were going to acquire another hospital, would not recognise this conversation. So I have a certain impatience with the narrowness of the argument that exists for trying to describe the totality of our industry.
We love investing. This is the thing. Sometimes someone finds a case study where we cut capital expenditure. What we try and cut is bad capital expenditure, but we love to invest. We have literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of euros, dollars, or whatever that people want us to invest well. So at the margin, quite often we are putting capital expenditure that a public company wouldn't be allowed to do, that a management was frightened of doing. Exactly, an emerging market there, saying what else can be done, what's the new opportunity. And I think the danger of this is it creates a sense that this is a zero-sum game, that we're cutting something off. Genuinely, the philosophical difference is, I believe, if you have an active, dynamic economy where change is permitted, actually the pie grows, and actually everybody grows, because you then have a bigger pie to take a share from. Where I have a problem is where it's presented as a zero-sum game, where this has been cut or that has been cut, and that is not the way we work. We're there to help create value. Occasionally that needs restructuring. Occasionally that needs a cut in R&D, because there's bad R&D spend. Occasionally it needs a cut in capital expenditure. But we love to spend. To spend well.
Okay, ich würde gerne noch eine Runde jetzt...
Let's have a further round before we give the audience an opportunity of making some comments at the beginning. I did touch upon the fact that the stock exchanges are dealing with other issues than private equity and hedge funds. There are all sorts of other concerns, quite different concerns, and the question is how, in the industry, in the private equity industry, are things going to continue? We've seen a number of crises over the last few years, and these were only possible because these companies had received a lot of money from the banks, and very clearly now, I think the signals are very clear. Credits from the banks are being cut now, and I would like to hear from the participants what the situation is, what's going to happen in the private equity sector. Mr. Leder. Well, I think you have to ask the people from the private equity what I can say on the subject is that 2 years ago, when the global union movement decided to privatize global equity, then there was almost no talk about it in the general public. But now we've started to make a real theme and issue. We've looked at the ways you work, and we've looked at positive and negative examples. And I have to say that in Europe, what we can see in Europe are not only good and positive examples, and I don't quite understand why you are so resistant to this concept of regulation, and that you just want to have self-regulation. If basically you agree that there should be some sort of regulation, certainly at the level of the EU, and if we look at what's being done in England at the governmental level, then I don't understand why there is this resistance, why you don't want to accept binding regulations. I think now that the discussion on these issues will have to continue on, partly because of the sovereign wealth funds. In the 18th century, at some time, following the French Revolution, these sovereign wealth funds came into being. But the dimension and the scope has increased so tremendously now that in Europe this has become a true issue and a theme for discussion. And now, of course, I don't know quite how we deal with this issue. That's an open issue. But there's a question of the geld flows, which are coming from the periphery of the financial world to the center rather than in the other direction. And that obviously leads to and has led to an active discussion, which is not going to be particularly altered because of the crisis, I don't think. Also, it's not clear to me if the crisis develops as is forecast. I don't know exactly what this will mean for private equity. Perhaps it'll create new opportunities for private equity and create greater difficulties for us. Well, now, what do you think? Do you think, Mr. Roux, that this is going to continue, the situation is going to continue? We've spoken about thousands of hedge funds. Now we have thousands of them. And these are really, they're not just locusts, they're tigers. Let's take an example. We have 1%, if you look at Ambro Bank, then they started with 1%, and they fragmented the company, and a lot of jobs were lost as a result of that. And I think that the story will continue. For example, because of the lack of willingness to accept responsibility. I think that there's a number of basic questions which have to be put to the financial industry. We've noticed in the financial crisis that nobody really knows what is exactly going to happen. Everything is so interlinked and interrelated, and things are presented then with different faces and different coverage, and we don't know what is going to happen, whether things are going to be sold or not. And so I think that very fundamentally we have to look at the dynamism and the self-dynamism of money. And Vespasian said, money doesn't stink. And Carlo Vespasian said that money isn't so smelly and horrible and odorous. The real problem, as I see it, is that I'm absolutely horrified that right up at the top even, nobody really knows what, where, and how things operate and how things are functioning, in fact. And here I don't absolutely agree with Mr. Levra, because I think that if we impose legislation on these people that they have to do this, that or the other and regulate things differently, then I don't think we'll be able to change attitudes. And if there isn't a change in the attitude of the leaders in the branches, if there isn't this change, an inner, internal change of mindset, then I don't think we'll solve the problem. I think we need both of these aspects. There has to be a readiness, a willingness on behalf of those who are responsible to take on and to shoulder responsibility.
Can I agree with much of what both of you said? I think that the reason I said at the beginning that we invest in real companies with sales and employees is this problem that has come about in the last 6-9 months is due to failures of what I would call the financing and financial system, right? Where when we go in and look at companies, there's lots of companies we look at and we don't buy. I've got professionals who've been in this business 20, 30 years who are judging very carefully what the risk of this company is and whether it's going to work or not. And sometimes they get it wrong. And one of the failures of the last 2 years is bank debt, which is supposed to go through the same process of evaluating the risk, has been chopped up into lots of little pieces and posted over to another set of people who are not able to see the underlying asset. And it's been presented in a way that frankly looks like it was dangerous. And that's what's been going on. And I think that the financing system I'm not against the evolution of financing systems. I think that's what's been very powerful globally. But there has been a period of clearly error in how this has developed. Our own view, and we're on the record, if you go back and look at our report and accounts for the last 2 years, was that the last 2 years was an exceptional period of, frankly, excessive financing. Our own firm, for a couple of years, has been very careful about where we would invest. And we've been selling a lot of assets during that period because we said these financing conditions will not last. But we're busy today, just to make sure people don't think that private equity has... We're busy because we've been building relationships, as opposed with banks who buy the whole debt and then distribute it out. Over the last couple of years, we've put in place our own separate team to work with the more regional and local banks on a bipartite basis, more traditional basis, so that we are busy today, although the leverage that we're getting is lower, which is good, we're able to have banks lend to us because it's the old-fashioned way where they look at the company and they take that risk on their own books as opposed to spending some of their time repackaging up. And I'm not against repackaging. I'm just saying the way in which repackaging has happened has clearly not been an advantage. It was presented as an advantage, and I think lessons will have to be drawn from the excess of this last period because it clearly has massive consequences on the financial system. And I think we all benefit from stable, growing, from time to time, innovative financial systems. But when something grows as fast as it has and it's not as understood as it should be, clearly something is not right. So I do agree with you, gentlemen, but this is not the end of private equity. I have to tell you, our teams are extraordinarily busy. We made a quarterly announcement today that's showing our investment continues to grow year on year. In the mid-market, which is where we are, the top end of the market is very quiet at the moment. In the mid-market, companies of a value of €1 billion, €1.5 billion, there is plenty of good companies. Yes, the economic environment is more uncertain than a year ago, but we're paid to look at that and to say, notwithstanding that, what is the value of our company? But we're substantially in agreement.
Beyond that,
I would just agree with what Will Philip said. One point I would say that an interesting aspect of the world markets, which will clearly touch us all, and it will touch our business in ways that we may not expect. But broadly within the emerging markets, as I said earlier, we don't borrow when we invest in our companies. A couple of reasons. There isn't an awful lot of availability of debt within these countries, but simply put, the businesses that we're investing in are growing so fast, they cannot take on debt. They want to invest in their businesses to grow. And I am reminded that the tagline on our front door is the positive power of capital. I certainly feel that's the role that we have to play, particularly in these turbulent times.
Thank you very much. So, jetzt Zeit, Fragen.
So now there's time for questions from the floor. Who would like to start? There are 2 microphones at the right, at the back. Yes, so this gentleman with the red tie.
I'm with Partnerships for Change, and we're involved in sustainable development in emerging markets. And the question really for Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Ye, I guess, is how do you deal with cultural differences when you're working in emerging markets where the people are not necessarily used to using credit, used to being involved in private enterprise, how do you work with their culture to embed that in the way that you work with their management teams that are indigenous?
Well, I mean, simply put, that wherever you go, wherever we invest, we have local teams. We don't invest in places where we don't have offices. So if you go to China, I've got a team in Beijing. If you go to India, I've got a team in Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, etc., etc. So locals, on the ground presence, and frankly, just a deep history of knowing how to do business. A previous employer of mine was Citibank, and the chairman used to say, we just know how to do business where you can't drink the water. And that's also, there is something intangible in a set of skills and a set of understandings that stretch, frankly, back many years, and are part of our DNA. I run this firm. I personally spent many years in Africa running other businesses. That sort of stamped my card for cross-cultural understandings.
Can I endorse all of that? I mean, we have teams on the ground in India and China, for example, which are local teams. Exactly the same thing. We used to, we've been investing behind entrepreneurs for many years. We know what it takes to help get the best out of a journey forward. One of the things that we do in our business, I'm sure Paul does in his, is actually help these firms improve so that they're ready to be listed. And that's actually part of the value proposition, is that we can help a company get to a situation where, with our name on it, it could go on the stock market and people can say the governance, the professionalism is all there. Not to say these companies are unprofessional, but they've grown from a different background. And I think it's in the same pack that comes out tomorrow from the World Economic Forum. There's a case study of a firm in China which is exactly that, which has grown very rapidly. I've met the chairman, shaken his hand, and we brought in outside directors who have international experience to work with him and get his company moving as quickly as it can in this fast environment.
Okay. Weitere Fragen?
Any further questions from the floor? Yes, here in the front row. Mr. Roof, you spoke about a solution from above, which doesn't actually exist. An earthquake, a war, a catastrophe in the world, and then the wonderful financial systems will break down. Can the system be done without God? Well, that's rather too high for me. Up in the heavens, I'm afraid. Well, that's on a completely different level. I don't know exactly how you meant what you said, but I think that, of course, mistakes are made, but I don't think there should be a direct link with God. That's not something that I would see anyway, or I wouldn't certainly not think in those terms. Rather, I think it's a question of responsibility and how to shoulder and deal with responsibility. Of course, you can say it's a problem because we don't really know what we're doing anymore. That's where the problem lies. If the financial industry, all of us, we don't really know what we're doing and what's going on. But I don't want to transform this into something of a theological nature. I think it's a very risky undertaking. When we're dealing with funds such massive amounts of money, then it's all a little risky, but I'm not going to have a direct contact with God on this issue. Thank you. Further questions? Yes, someone in the middle. My question is, who are the typical investors in private equity and hedge funds, and what are the profits which can be expected?
I don't really I'm not very good at answering on hedge funds. I know the people who invest we have two sources of capital. We have our own balance sheet, which is the general public in the UK can buy them. We have widows and orphans funds and all the rest of it. We now have over 20% of our shareholding from US fund managers. So that's the public shareholding. The private funds we run, which which go alongside, include sovereign wealth funds. They include very large endowments and pension funds in the US, and they would be investing on behalf of the pensions of teachers and workers and whatever. And that is the main source. Now, I suspect you'll find that hedge funds, it's not dissimilar, but to be honest, I don't know. I'm not an expert on hedge funds.
We would have the same category of investors investing in our funds. You asked a question about returns. Well, there's two parts to that question. As we look at an investment, we would typically target an internal rate of return of about 25%. Is what would be our target returns. We would typically aim to give an investor back at least 2 times the money that he gave us. Is another way of thinking about it.
And we have public targets of around 20% for buyouts, 20% for growth, which we've been beating, particularly in the recent environment. And then translating that down to return on equity, we say, depending on the level of gearing, in the high teens to 20%. And again, if you look at our track record over the last 3-4 years, you'll see that has been coming through pretty consistently. The issue, any fool can get returns in a short term. The issue is to make sure that the risk is managed around those returns. So we talk about the volatility in any particular year, but we spend all our time trying to make sure that we can give back a money multiple. You give us 100 today, and in 2.5 years' time, or whatever it is, you will get hopefully at least 200 back, and the recent period has been a lot better.
I'm not sure the point has been made earlier, but the way our business is organized is that investors give us money for 10 years. They commit capital today, and we have an obligation to return it back to them by the end of 10 years. And it's within that period of 10 years that we make the investments, we hold on to the investment in the companies, grow the business, and sell it. So it's essentially a long-term business.
Mm-hmm. Can I make one other point as well? And it goes to this bigger question of why there are problems in the financial system. In our business and in most of our industry, our people who invest the money on my behalf, I've got teams, 250, 300 people around the world doing this every day. They only get paid a share of profits when we exit. So there is no put this investment on the book and give me a bonus and everything's all right. We do pay our people bonuses for hard work, but the substantial amount of money they get is when an investment finally, 2, 3, 4 years down the track, makes a profit. And if it makes a loss, it shrinks the pool. So our people are very careful about what they do. Yes, they can make a lot of money, but it is not an easy task. But they only get paid when the money goes back to the people who gave us the money, which again makes it very long term.
I would like to make 2 comments on what we've heard. And first of all, one of the problems is the question of returns on investment, and there has to be a considerably aggressive position if you really wish to make the obtain the appropriate returns and don't wish to neglect your employees. Secondly, I said earlier that as trade unions we had 2 objectives, and this has to be discussed with private equity. And the second objective is there where we have some influence, that is as regards the strategies of the pension funds and their investment strategies, where in the United States the unions have a tremendous pension funds which are managed, and there we have to have a carefully thought out investment strategy, not just the classical traditional approach which has existed in certain industrial areas. That's to say, we don't invest, for example, in the arms industry, for example, and in certain other areas. What we have to do is to have certain forms of investment which we've thought about, whether we wish to follow these or not. Hedge funds, for example, and private equity are ones where we feel that we have to establish certain guidelines. Let me just give you an example. We had a problem with Blackstone, the main shareholder of Deutsche Telekom, and there was a long-term strike in the telecom business, and everybody in the German union felt that as a result of Blackstone representation on the board, that was
Wir waren ja ein Gewerkschaftskongress in Athen.
likely to lead to wage cuts, and the representatives of German Telecom.
Eine Frage von uns beantworten, wie viel habt ihr?
And we had to answer this rather unpleasant question of how much was invested, and the answer was 5 billion. So, of course, that does change the proportions a little bit. Any further questions?
Die Kaufleute, die durch diesen Handel mit
the merchants who have become rich through this will not hear all the complaints. In 1 hour, all wealth was destroyed because God judged men. One is blessed and rich, and one calls oneself a Christian, but one doesn't really know what God has decided a long time ago because of the debt and the blood debt that sticks to their fingers. That wasn't a question, but that's how I see it. If we don't pay attention to God, we can be as rich as we want to, if it will end badly.
Dame dort.
Ja, danke.
Thank you. Well, the discussion to me seems to have focused only on private equity, and Messrs. Year and Fletcher are the representatives of private equity firms, but we were supposed to also talk about hedge funds this evening, and we really haven't heard very much about them tonight. Hedge funds usually have offshore domiciles in places where it's very difficult to know whether there's been any insider trading or not, or other irregularities. So I'd be very happy if we were to discuss this a little more. Well, we have neglected hedge funds a little tonight because we have no representative as such of the hedge funds, but Mr. Roux is willing to make a few statements about hedge funds. He's very kind to do so. Yes, let me make a few critical comments. I already mentioned this or touched upon it earlier on. We have to understand that the private equity culture is one, but in the background there's also the hedge funds culture. We may not forget that. And what you have already said about private equities is very hedge-oid, if I may say so, Mr. Levra. Perhaps I could just enumerate a few things that worry me. For example, with 1% of share capital, a firm like Ambro Bank could be simply cut up into pieces simply by media policies and spreading fear. That is to say, buy companies and then simply run them to ground. Then, in the meantime, buy some derivatives before you've skimmed all the profits. Hedge funds aim at getting out as much as possible out of the companies they take over. I know of cases where companies have tried to get some influence in the hedge funds and to dismantle the corporate culture, to pocket the reserves, or to stay on the subject of hedge funds. There's another strategy I've heard about, according to which a gigantic dividend has to be paid out in the first year. This destroys the company. Then those parts which still can be sold off are sold off. The employees are jobless. Then there's the issue of transparency. Who are the investors in hedge funds? Who is it who invests in hedge funds? I'd be interested to know this in contrast to private equity funds. You hardly ever know who the true investors are in the hedge funds. And then there's the question of the corporate law and shareholder law and legislation. I think these are subjects that would have to be discussed in the connection with hedge funds. That would be the topics of tonight's discussion, and has to be kept in mind when we consider the possibility of international regulation. There's a question here at the back of the hall.
I have two questions. The first one is, when somebody says, I can give you 25% return, the question is, what are the risks? Because if the return is so high, it means that the concomitant risks are also high. So what are the key risks of private equity activity? It's a question for Mr. Ye and Mr. Fletcher, because they've been saying waxing lyrical about private equity, but what are the key risks and how do you mitigate these risks? And the second one is, a lot of the activity of private equity players in countries like South Africa, where I come from, has been to target companies that are listed on the stock exchanges, which are, because they're listed, available to everybody to invest in, institutions and individuals. And these companies are targeted by private equity players and then delisted, taken off the exchange, usually with the under the guise that the strategy is going to be changed. And so the private equity players have an idea of how to run the companies better. But this is sometimes done with the help and with cutting into deals the incumbent managers, whose responsibility it is anyway to change the strategy, but they work with the private equity players to ostensibly change the strategy of the company when the company is in private hands. And these companies are offered to the current shareholders, which is the public and institutions and pension funds, and then delisted and laden with debt, and so on. So there is not a lot of transparency, but it would appear that, and in South Africa, that is the bulk of the private equity activity. It's an emerging market economy where we need to encourage public participation in the equity markets. I just wanted the two gentlemen to comment on the role of private equity in those instances. Thanks.
Can I do them in reverse order and pick up your second one first? I mean, I think in any delisting of a company, and that delisting of companies happens, in most markets, there is obviously a clear risk of conflict of interest, which the board of the exiting company has to deal with, and which is the incumbent coming in. You have to be aware of. The issue that I would say is, just because it's the same management doesn't mean that they've kind of been bribed to do something that is bad, and therefore it is bad. I believe that private equity is in some ways the purest form of capitalism. There is the shareholder on the board, able to manage a company, in a very tight environment. There's a very tight discussion between the shareholder and management around problems, and quite often a set of widely dispersed public company shareholders are not able to get around what that problem is, and are not able to allow a management team to deal with that. And that so-called agency problem is one of the reasons from time to time taking a company private can actually create value, because you have a shareholder who knows why he owns the shares, understands the risks, and is supportive of a management team that might not be able to do things otherwise. On your question of returns and risks, the risks, to be honest, vary by each investment. What our people are paid to do is look at, is it a market risk, is it an operational risk, is it a management risk, and because of the clarity of our agenda, we probably work pretty quickly to deal with those risks and to respond to those risks as they arise. And that, I guess, is the experience that comes from the better private equity firms, is that they can respond quickly because they've seen these things many times before. In the case of LBOs, there can also be financial risk as well. But every single investment that comes up doesn't press the button and 25% comes out. There are some higher risk opportunities where we seek a higher return, and to be honest, in any portfolio there's some lower risk opportunities where we seek a lower return. The critical thing which we do get paid for, because we do take money off the top when it works, is actually being able to mitigate those risks such that the 2 times money multiple or the 20 or 25% IRR is delivered. That's what we get paid to do, but it gets broken down asset by asset. In emerging markets, there's quite often a different set of risks to in a low growth economy, but they do literally vary company by company, market by market.
On the issue of risk, I think of 2 risks. I think of the risk of management. You don't get great companies unless they're well led. In fact, there's total correlation between poorly performing investments and not having a good management team. So I think we get paid to find people, coach people to be good managers. And the other risk I mentioned a little earlier on is this issue of governance. Governance sounds like a very boring word, but in fact it goes to the heart of how a company is run. And if a company is run badly and it makes its decisions without transparency, if there are poor ethics in a company, again, you have a high correlation to a badly performing investment. So get both of those right, you're well on the way. I would just like to pick up on your the point. You said you're from South Africa. South Africa is, as you well know, a very transparent, highly regulated environment with the protection of investors at the forefront there. And I think we need to recognise the companies that come off stock exchanges are spending time waiting to come back onto the stock exchange, because as a private equity investor, that would really be a home run, is to deliver a company back through an IPO.
One follow-up, please, from your colleague.
I think let me say one thing ab initio, and that is that private equity should not be demonized, and it does a lot of good, especially companies like Actis that invest in emerging markets, because quite often the experience and information that they bring into the developed markets is useful. But the question that is being asked by Brian here has not been answered, because one of the questions he's asked is, in a market like South Africa, where we have been having the problem of conglomeration and the lack of participation of the citizens of that country in the stock exchange, the taking away of companies from the stock exchange creates a different kind of problem to the kinds of things that you have been talking about here. And then secondly, I don't know what Mr. Fletcher would say about Alexander Forbes, whether in fact what he just said about bad management and bad that and the other applies to a company like Alexander Forbes. But the experience also has been that in the majority of cases, the money is raised internally in the country as opposed to coming externally as a form of FDI. And therefore, if private equity investment is just another form in which people use in order to make money, let's just say so. But I think the virtues of the industry that you've been extolling are a little bit stretched, in my view.
To comment on that?
I didn't know whether it was a question or a comment. I think we both know the environment very well in South Africa, and I think I would just go back to my last comment that one element of the private equity industry, as you know, is to invest in public companies, to take them off stock exchanges, to work with those companies over a period of time. And the return of those companies to the stock exchange with broad-based ownership, as you desire, is absolutely congruent with the intentions of a private equity investor.
And I didn't refer to it. We don't do business in South Africa, but actually we do have now a separate business that we're starting, which actually will take minority investments in public companies without taking them private, to help those companies do things with a strong supportive shareholder that they can't. So in fact, we think there's a continuing sort of convergence going on, because we think if we can do a minority in a private company and help it, why wouldn't we take a minority with a public company? And this is not an aggressive, this is working with a management team to do something that their current shareholding won't let them do. This is working with them.
Nur Zeit für eine letzte Frage.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, the gentleman in front there. My question is, over the last decade, I've had two experiences. One where there was very little money involved, and then one higher up the scale, so to speak, where new relations of mine in America entered into wealth management. They, in fact, followed the training which they'd been given in Switzerland earlier, and they were able to double in 2 or 3 years the money which had been invested. Now, at the lower level, however, there were children and money invested for children, and there were 2 customers in a Swiss bank and there were no payments made, and there were some 350 francs which shrank to nothing because of costs. The Swiss banks have good advisors, it seems, but I wonder if you see a possibility whereby, as was in the past 30, 40 years ago, money was not lost as it is now because of inflation and other aspects. I, at the other end of the scale, invested a little money for street children in the third world, and a few thousand francs were invested, and a business management, fund management company was responsible, and people who had trained in Switzerland said, well, we're going to become independent now. And they went to America, as I said earlier, and then they left America and went to Canada because they didn't get a... Could we have the question, please, as the moderator? Well, the question is, last year, this Swiss person who went to Canada, a very serious person, fell into a trap. It might have been a hedge fund, and he thought that he was going to make tremendous profits, and then he lost a lot of money, and the American state held back all the money, and my few $1,000s for the orphans, well, I'm not too upset about those, but in the future it would be a good thing if for poorer persons, for children, and those who have little money, somebody could in fact do something. Well, Mr. Roux, our ethical specialist, well, I think it's fairly easy. Change your bank. To which bank should I go? Asked the speaker from the floor, I think. Well, I could mention 1 or 2, said Mr. Roux. Change your bank and never invest without demanding whether there's been some ethical assessment carried out beforehand. Have you something which you can offer for someone who wishes to make ethical investments, and if they can't offer you anything, then you go to another bank? And the short answer is change your bank and make sure that you invest in a bank which has ethical concerns. Now, this question of the difference between private equity hedge funds and leveraged buyouts, we've seen that private equity firms do a great deal of good. We've had two representatives here who aren't amongst the locusts, I'm sure. Some want more regulation, others want a little less. Some are in favor of their own code of conduct rather than legislation. I wish you all a pleasant stay in Davos, and I would like to thank our panelists very much.
Oh, merci. Oh, okay.